Good morning and welcome to episode 17 of BuiltPlace's Housing Conversations. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Foye from the University of Glasgow and CACHE, who'll be talking to us about some of his research into the framing, the narratives and outcomes of the housing crisis. Good morning, Chris. Thanks for joining me today.
Morning, Neil. Pleasure.
And the housing crisis is being, it's very much in the, a key political and public issue at the moment, albeit kind of slightly displaced by the bigger issues we're facing right now. But there's continuing debate, and there's a whole wide range of different ideas for the causes of and solutions to the housing crisis. And we've seen the government's narrative around the issue has changed over the period of the last three Conservative governments. We had the Cameron-Osborne era, where the housing crisis was very much a crisis of home ownership, and policy was very focused around fixing the declines in home ownership that we'd seen following the credit crunch. Under Theresa May, that slightly changed and became much more of a crisis of supply, a lack of new supply, and there was a much broader focus on supply of all tenures, though clearly still with a preference for home ownership. And more recently, it's still not particularly clear, but it does seem that there's been a bit more of a focus back towards home ownership rather than housing supply. That said, there's still an awful lot of people who are still espousing, the idea and the belief that, housing supply is the single fundamental issue underpinning the housing crisis, and that's what we need to fix. And so I was just wondering, Chris, how your research that you've done in recent years has kind of focused on this framing of the housing crisis narrative.
Yeah, well, this is kind of it's a fairly kind of recent research interest in mine, because it's sort of, and it stems from my job, which is kind of at this interface of academia and kind of policy and practice, and in that kind of that boundary space between those two, and it's something that's sort of interests me is in the differences between those two spheres, and whereas the academic sphere tend to be quite broad in its understanding of the housing crisis, and it tends to take a very, very kind of, you can incorporate lots of different causes, and they aren't mutually exclusive. I find that kind of in the practice sphere, it tends to be it tends to be framed in a very, very reductive way, and it's always. And I think it comes back to sort of a point that you and Michael Edwards have talked about, kind of it being bedeviled by rival simplifications, and this idea that and I became quite interested in why that was the case, and also, I mean, when you look at sort of the work of Jeff Mead and people, I mean, you were and sort of saying, we kind of know what the drivers of house prices are. There's a fairly academic consensus on what, and kind of the role of interest rates and there's the role of supply. But when it comes to, so there's not that, it's kind of, the debate's not amongst kind of neoclassical economists in that academic sphere. The debate isn't that hostile as far as I can see, at least in the journal articles. But when you go to the kind of the practice sphere, it becomes a lot more hostile, a lot more kind of antagonistic. And I think I became interested in why that was the case. And I think a large part of the case is that in your policy practice, you're aiming to advance a particular solution and a particular policy agenda, and policy agenda, and because a lot of this is kind of reliant on capturing ministers' attention, capturing the attention of the media, those are things that are very, very scarce. So you have to try and basically, I think the kind of logics of that kind of sphere force kind of think tanks, be commentators, to reduce everything down to a single frame in order to get their policies across. And I think that's how it becomes. I think that's how it becomes kind of bedeviled by rival simplifications, because they have so little time to actually capture the attention that they need. Everything needs to be reduced down. Otherwise, if you say, oh well, it's just it's just all very complicated. There's lots of different housing markets. It's not going to really capture attention. So I find that quite convincing as an explanation. And I think if you look at what a successful frame entails. I think it's got a definition of the problem. It's got a kind of someone who's some things to blame, and then it's got a solution. And obviously, if you're an organization that's seeking to seek political change, that solution has to be politically feasible. It has to be politically, it has to be feasible as well in terms of it actually work in reality. But it also has to pass through Parliament. So I think that's quite interesting, because some frames don't have that. I think that's perhaps why they don't succeed so much.
Yeah, I suppose I can think of three framings at the moment that are very popular. You've got your it's planning, reform the planning system. You've got we need to build more council homes, and the third, probably less popular one generally, but seems to be working its way through government, is it's 95% mortgages that are the barrier. And those three seem to be the three that are kind of capturing the narratives at the moment, with differing levels of success in terms of their actual hit rate on senior politicians. And it was suggested to me, just to kind of echo what you were just saying there, by someone I know who used to work in the think tank world, that the challenge is that a senior minister can only hold one idea around one particular topic in their head at any particular time, and so you need a kind of a 1 or 2 word problem and solution in one, hence kind of home ownership or housing supply, and so that very much limits it. And so how with your kind of looking at both sides of it, and so how does it look from you sat in the world of academia, where there seems to be this broader level of consensus, or at least consensus around the idea that it's complicated and that there's no single issue, when you look at the debate happening in the more think tank and public sphere of the housing debate?
I mean, it's obviously seen with sort of an academic set of values, where you're only pursuing knowledge for its own sake. I mean, that's obviously a kind of slight idealistic version of it. But I mean, it's if you're seeking to broadly capture kind of what academia is about, then that's probably as close as you're going to get to it. Seen from that perspective, it's probably quite frustrating. I mean, I know some academics do kind of get quite frustrated by it, but then I think I think you have to accept at the same time that policies made, and to influence policy, you have to kind of, if academic knowledge has to be adapted to the logics of that particular sphere, if it's to have any impact. And I think if there's a certain compromise involved, and that compromise can often be quite frustrating. It can be quite demoralizing. But I think it's, at the same time, you just have to recognize that's the way the world is being. But I mean, it might have happened in the 60s and 70s, when kind of academic economists were highly influential in policy. But I mean, particularly amongst the Labour Party and that kind of Keynesian consensus. But that's gone now. So I think you have to, if you want to kind of, if you want to transfer academic knowledge into the kind of policy now, you need to kind of recognize the way the logics of dictate that particular sphere.
Yeah, and I suppose academics aren't above getting involved in the fray themselves. There are we see examples where there are very clear narratives from particular housing academics, whereby their analysis and results are very much kind of centered around one of these particular issues. So I guess you're not immune from it within academia more generally.
Yeah, no, exactly. There's some, I'd say, particularly urban economists have probably been most influential on kind of in that media sphere. I'm thinking of people kind of like Ed Glazer in the States, and then there's kind of equivalents in the UK. And I think when you kind of look at the way, if as to why they kind of achieve so much impact, I think part of it's because of the kind of widespread recognition that the status that that neoclassical economics has in the policy and practice circle. I mean, you quite often hear the word economist used the kind of as a well the main this is what mainstream economists think, and that this kind of idea that mainstream economics is this kind of one uniform discipline, when in reality it's kind of lots of different disciplines which kind of have different sort of epistemic values. That is, I mean, if you look at kind of institutional economists, they go about their research in a very, very different way to what kind of sort of highly kind of quantitative empirical economists like Ike Laser does, in terms of just looking at these econometric models. And I think there's a particular, I suppose, it's a bit of a problem with kind of that urban economics model being translated into policy and practice as well, because that urban economics model is based upon carefully circumscribed kind of models which isolate one particular causal relationship. For example, the effect of planning regulations on house prices. But then they're backward looking, and they're kind of inherently simplifying. Whereas when you're in policy practice, of course, it's the world's inherently complex, and there's kind of it's difficult to then just take that relationship forward. I.e., just because planning kind of regulations exhibit this effect on house prices, therefore we should get rid of planning regulations. You know, to take a kind of extreme simplification. But I mean, there's a kind of problem when you go straight from that sphere to the kind of the policy practice sphere.
Yeah, and I suppose it's a challenge for academics and others who, you know, maybe would like to see policy recognizing some of these complexities that actually, you know, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for them to cut through, you know, kind of and make those points that are heard beyond, you know, some of the more technical aspects of the civil service and areas like that. And so, you know, I suppose it's a big challenge for academics generally and everyone else, you know, to how do you compete, you know, for this attention, if that is, you know, kind of the purpose that you're seeking, particularly when, you know, for example, you know, you could be sat there for 6 months or a year writing a research paper, and a think tank or a consultancy or even myself, we could knock out a paper over the weekend that, you know, purports to do the same kind of analysis and gets to the same findings as you, but clearly much less robustly and far less research, far less depth in terms of the research, but because of the position where those groups sit, actually they're far more likely to get attention from policymakers. And I suppose that's a challenge for academia, if it, you know, with impact being more important and other issues like that.
Yeah, and it raises kind of, it's sort of, as I say, it's kind of one of those things that raises, you can see the tensions between that kind of those two spheres all the time. And, you know, it's if you want to get impact, you kind of have to you have to kind of reduce down, and you also have to come up with kind of recommendations. And I think neither of those things are particularly encouraged in academia. I think generally we're not, as I said, it tends to be backward looking, and therefore it doesn't really tend to think that deeply about kind of what policy should be doing. It's more what effect it had in the past. And I think then it also tends to expand out, whereas kind of policy practice tends to expand it to kind of to reduce in. So I think both those kind of there's those two tensions, and yeah, it's constant. I mean, when you write policy briefings, or you're having to, like, I don't know, talk to, if you ever, I haven't talked to that much media, but if I think when you do talk to media, you're told to reduce everything down to essentially two messages, or one or two kind of key messages. So it's, and I think that's that's one of those things that's kind of involves quite a lot of compromise, in academic principles.
So I suppose it's going to be an ongoing challenge that we see, and you know, one of the challenges that you've done some work on is actually evaluating housing outcomes. And, you know, clearly if the causes of the housing crisis or housing crises are multiple, then kind of the views of what the outcome to fixing the housing crisis are also multiple, and could depend on very much on individuals' perceptions. And so I was just wondering if you could talk through some of your research that you've done around evaluating the outcome of housing policy and interventions.
Yeah, so this is a paper. I worked on it with David Clapham. Kind of this is we published it kind of, it was published on the CACHE website. It's called Evaluating Housing Outcomes.
I'll put a link in the comments when we.
Thanks, Neil. And it kind of started with the principle that we tend to think that there is a kind of successful housing system out there, which will satisfy everyone. And the problem is we just haven't found how to get there yet. And we have all these kind of roads put in front of us to kind of get there, be it kind of changing the planning system, we're kind of reforming the way the kind of land market, or and we just need to choose one of these roads, and then we choose the right road, we'll get there. And that's sort of, and I kind of I suppose that was one kind of, and I think both David and I felt that it was that kind of denied the inherently political aspect of what we're talking about, in that, to an extent, it's only to an extent, but to an extent, for the housing crisis, for housing problems to be addressed, there's a trade-off between different interests, and it's not, there's not kind of, everyone's interests aren't exactly harmonious. Now, I think there are solutions that it's not entirely a zero-sum game. There are solutions that obviously boost societal well-being and kind of but I think that there's a lot of politics, there's trade-off involved. So kind of recognizing that trade-off, and I think then the second sort of rationale for that kind of paper was that in academia, I noticed that there's very rarely any talk about values, or about what values should motivate policy. It tends, and if they are, it tends to be very implicit. I mean, what are we trying to do in policy? Are we trying to, what with housing policy? Are we trying to, are we trying to kind of give everyone a decent, accessible home? Are we trying to address homelessness? Are we trying to kind of reduce house prices at the top end of the spectrum of objectification? And these, I don't think these different objectives aren't always harmonious. So it's kind of, I think, but in academia, there's a reluctance to kind of explicitly state a kind of what we call a normative position, a position that explicitly says this is what should happen because this, to actually be open about one's values. So I suppose that was the kind of those are the two kind of pillars for rationales for the paper, for the kind of paper, and it essentially looked at then the different, well, how if it's important how we measure, if how we measure well-being, if how we measure and evaluate housing outcomes is important, then what are the different kind of different metrics or information spaces that we would use to do that? And it went through kind of subjective, objective, and kind of more, and then economic, and then it kind of advanced the idea of capabilities, which is the idea that that essentially when we evaluate housing policy, it should be done on the basis of people's capabilities. That is what they're of the things they're essentially able to do. So rather than just looking at people's mental states or people's economic kind of well-being, we should judge success on the basis of the kind of the effective freedoms that individuals have, whether they realize those freedoms or not. And it kind of it talks through why that's the best information space as opposed to those other three. So I think that's, yeah.
So within that you used household space and overcrowding as an example of how you might approach that. I was wondering, do you want to maybe use that as an example here for, clearly that there's overcrowding. at the moment, a lot of the way we measure it is very, it's formulaic, and there's a specific way of measuring overcrowding. And if you actually ever look at the formula, it's quite interesting actually how it does work it out, and the age of your children, and whether they're sharing a bedroom and how much space you should have. And there's quite a big debate around the size of homes and whether we need more small homes for people in city centres. And then clearly there's then the permitted development right issue at the moment, where we've seen a lot of people being moved into very small, poor quality homes, and that clearly is an issue. And I think, from my understanding of what you're saying there, is it's not necessarily that we make sure that there's a lower level of that there's kind of a space standards that people absolutely are guaranteed to have, because there may well be people who want to live in space that is smaller than that. But the key is to make sure that the people who are living in those small spaces have the capability to move elsewhere. Is that the right kind of understanding of that?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean that's a fascinating example. It's probably the most obvious example, where you have, I think, a lot of the debate around space standards is kind of boils down to difference in values. And you have kind of I think it's been historically so as well. I mean, you have a kind of, so if we start with the kind of the kind of standard economist's view, is the idea that if individuals choose to live here, this is where they choose to spend their money, then we shouldn't judge them for doing so. And therefore, if people want to buy a tiny home rather than living in a shared accommodation, then who's the planner to say that shouldn't be allowed? And then you kind of have, that's kind of one perspective. And then you have a kind of another perspective, which is kind of from the more public health kind of, I suppose, planning perspective. And this is kind of it's that views certain things as views kind of overcrowding as being somehow objectively harmful. And there's kind of quite a few instances, and we talk about one in the paper, where sort of public health officials have come into homes where sort of grandmothers and daughters are sharing accommodation, for example, or sharing a room, for example, and they say, oh, no, this is atrocious. We can't allow this to happen. This now seems to break up. When in fact, the people, the kind of the family living in the house had other options. They just were choosing not to exercise them, because in some societies, and the example in the case we cite is Mexico, it's considered to be to be healthy to share a room with your grandmother. I mean, I think there was this quote from one of the studies I read, saying, well, how they felt so sorry for them. I think it was the Mexican immigrants, and they felt so sorry for all these people who were having to sleep in their rooms. They must feel so lonely. So it's good. I think that those two kind of positions are very much in opposition, and I think there's something in both of them. In that, on the kind of economic side of things, I do think people are often best to judge their own well-being, and if some people want to buy something, then they're probably in the best position to buy that. But on the public health side, I think at the same time, people can have often, if people have experienced really awful housing standards, their kind of expectations can drop so much that they don't have any. They kind of just accept that that's the state of affairs. And there's also I think there is some tentative evidence. I'm not convinced as to how rigorous it is, that kind of overcrowding does affect the health and well-being. But I'm not sure how, to what extent that's dependent on the culture. To what extent it's kind of absolute. And I think what you said is capability is trying to kind of steer middle way between those two, and it sort of says, well, what matters is that individuals have an opportunity to have proper space. So it's not just because someone someone through a kind of transaction chose to buy it, chose to live or rent a micro home, doesn't mean that they wouldn't have wanted a better home in the first instance. So it's saying what matters ultimately is whether individuals have that capability to have a bigger home, a home of a reasonable size, where reasonable is judged by the kind of the community at large. And at the minute, I think lots of people probably don't. So I think you'd argue that was a case of injustice. But I think it's, with all these things with values, you get into quite abstract discussions. But if I think space is one of those areas where it really manifests itself in quite concrete terms.
Yeah, I mean, it all suggests that trying to find both your simple single narrative for what's wrong, and then also your simple single narrative for how we should go about fixing it is not going to be easy, and perhaps forever subject to failure. And I suppose we need to hope that one of these simple single solutions does enough to help improve outcomes more broadly. I guess is my rather negative take from your research.
No, I think it's. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think if you're trying to take a principle out of, if I was to kind of approach kind of policy and an academic debate with the principle, it would be kind of the idea of fallibility and the idea that there's of kind of complexity, and that you can't we're always making mistakes, and therefore we should always be willing to kind of be open-minded and consider flaws in our own arguments and our own proposals, and be open to the idea of others. And it's quite difficult to do. I mean, sometimes, and because you can sometimes quite, you have kind of deep feelings against a particular agenda or for a particular agenda. But I think it's really important. I think both those kind of schools of thought with the kind of the papers emphasize, I think, that if you're to reduce them down to a single message, it would be you need to kind of expose yourself to those different perspectives. But at the same time, I think it can almost be paralyzing in that you kind of think, oh well, it's also complex, and there's all these values at stake which can't be reduced down. So I don't know what to do, and I think that's the kind of the danger to the other end of the spectrum. And I think that's what academics sometimes are a bit vulnerable to, is you think, oh, it's also complex, so I just won't bother, disengage all the time entirely. So I think it's a fine balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Chris, thank you. That's been absolutely fascinating. I've taken up more than enough of your time, so thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Pleasure, Neil.